Started. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our Wild About Roses program. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the A&R Extension Educator for Clay and Owen counties. I've been in my position for about 5 years. A lot of my work covers insects as I am an entomologist, but within our experience and our plague years so far, I've become very involved in horticulture. And I've been learning lots and lots as I've tried to develop my own plants in my own property, including roses. Now, I'm going to share a secret with you. Please don't ever come by my yard, because you will find that I want you guys to do what I say and not what I do, please. However, a little less jokingly, I've been actually fairly lucky with my roses. When I bought my property, there was one knockout bush and one hybrid tea. The knockout has been struggling for years. However, the hybrid tea is just going gangbusters. It's gorgeous. It blooms every year. It's unusually resilient, which is not something I would normally ascribe to a hybrid tea. Usually, I would be more concerned about that and less about the knockout. Since then, we planted one more knockout in my backyard, and we've got a climber growing near my patio right now. And they're kind of coming along slow because it has been an unusual set of years for growing. The temperatures have been a little odd. The timing of the seasons has been a little odd. So why don't we go ahead and just dive into the meat of what we're going to be talking about tonight. For those of you who have been to my rose programs before, a lot of this will seem familiar. I've talked about this because some of this just doesn't change. But I'm also adding in some other things too, because I like going over history and I like going over the origins of some of the things we see. Now, there's only so much I can talk about within the scope of a 30-minute to 45-minute program, but I'm going to try to do my best. So why don't we just go ahead and jump in and get started with some of the things that people encounter the most with roses. And if there is something that sticks out in your mind with that, feel free to share it with everyone in the chat. I want you guys to interact with each other and share your own experiences with each other for those of you who are willing to. But what I'm going to get us started with are going to be questions that I, as an extension educator, get that I see as the most common issues that people just simply don't realize that they have when they're working with their roses. So here are just a few of the things that I usually get phone calls about. Someone calls me and their roses never put out leaves. Someone will call me and say that the roses grow, but the blooms never really seem to happen. Or they'll call me and say that the canes have blackened or the leaves are spotty and they don't know why their roses are having problems. A lot of these often have very, very similar causes. A lot of them just come down to either poor site selection, or maybe that there's a disease that's active amongst their roses, or maybe even they don't quite know how to feed them. A lot of folks don't realize is that while we love roses, roses are typically kind of delicate plants compared to a lot of other ones, and they can come with a host of problems. Just because something has been hybridized here in Indiana doesn't necessarily mean that it's real successful here in Indiana. So let's talk about some of the ways you can try to limit what's going to cause you problems. Now, site selection is perhaps the most important one, which is why I put it first. Site selection is going to involve a combination of figuring out an area that's going to combine the best amount of sun or shade with the best amount of water or dryness and the most fertile soil that the plant is going to be able to take advantage of. So roses, they're going to require at least 6 hours of direct sunlight. Sometimes I've seen roses that require a little bit more than that. 6 hours is probably kind of light. Whereas other species may actually be even more delicate, and 6 hours may be pushing it a little bit, and you're going to want them to have a little bit of shade. It really depends on what you're growing. For example, if I were growing a knockout like the ones I mentioned earlier, I want them to get that good dose of sunlight. However, some of our climbers, they're going to be a little more delicate. They're going to be a little more challenging. So you may want to see and experiment a little bit with how well they handle full doses of sunlight, or if they want that little bit of shade. Another thing to consider with your roses is that air circulation is going to be very, very important to helping you prevent disease. A lot of us don't realize that. We create our ornamental landscapes with just thick with different flowers because we like that appearance. But the trouble is, the closer things are together, the more easy it is for fungal infections and bacterial infections to spread among them. So air circulation is going to be very important to keeping those roses healthy. And kind of what I was just talking about there, where we have lots and lots of things pushed together, roses do not do well in competition with other plants. They are your standalone child who wants to be admired. They don't want anybody shoving into their area. Look at me. Don't try to put the siblings next to the roses. They are not going to do well. Leave them by themselves. So I created a little bit of a game I want to play with you guys. And what I want you to do is I want you to tell me which of these spots looks like the most ideal location for a rose. So I'm going to start here and I'm going to say, let's look at image number 1 that I have there. Who here thinks that that is a good location for a rose? By the way, the side of the building that you're facing right now faces north. And go ahead and put in the chat who thinks this is a poor location or a good location. Yeah, so lots of people are saying it is a poor location. It's got northern exposure, which means that the sunlight is going to be very limited compared to the southern or western sides of the building. And this has lots of vegetables in it. So it's a very crowded location and nutrient competition is going to be very, very high. So what about image number 2 there? What you're seeing is someone pruning a rose bush that is standing in a patch of mulch. And you can kind of see the angle of the sun and the amount of sun that it's getting. Would you say that's a good location or a poor location?
Good.
Yeah, that is definitely a good location for that one because it's getting plenty of sunlight. It is not in competition with any other plants. What you don't realize is that this is actually a picture of Rosie Lerner handling her roses. Before her retirement, Rosie Lerner was the extension horticulturist with Purdue University. So a lot of the information I'm giving you is actually her hard work. So yes, that is definitely a good location for them. Now let's take image number 3. That is a display garden at one of the horticultural buildings on Purdue's campus. And you could see lots of different ornamental flowers there. Would you say that is a poor location for a rose or a good one? Yeah, it is a poor location. While that is a gorgeous setup, and I have been there myself, it is a lovely place to walk during the spring and summer. It's very fragrant. Unfortunately for roses, they would not handle that nearly as well as the rest of those flowers. Roses need to, remember, they're a special child. They need all the attention and no one else near them. So that would not be a great location. Though I think in the background, if you look real carefully, you might be able to see a few potential rose bushes way back there. And then let's take a look at image number 4, that nice foresty scene. Would that be a poor location or a good location? Yeah, and everybody's pretty much in agreement there. It's a poor location. It has far too much shade. One of the things that you may not realize too, looking at it, all that green is ground cover. So the roses would be in immediate competition with all of the ground cover there. And also there would be probably be high nutrient competition. A lot of the trees that we love to plant in our yards typically are nutrient hogs, especially something like an oak tree. They are not going to be very friendly with roses. So if you're trying to create an ornamental landscape feature that involves ornamental flowers around a tree, you don't want to put roses there. Something like marigolds would honestly be better. Okay, let's keep moving here. So I want to talk to you guys about some of our subsets of roses. Now, some of you on here may know lots about the different sets of roses and the different types. And my plan is in a future program, I want to dig into some specific varieties of roses, specific cultivars of like hybrid teas. I don't have the ability to do it in this program. We just don't have enough time. I'm going to go kind of broad. And there are going to be different definitions depending on who you talk to. The information I'm giving you here is from an extension service who has done research on this. And whereas you may hear different things from other people. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we would call an old European garden rose. These are our original roses from the old world. These are roses that date back many centuries, and they're generally labeled in 5 different subtypes. These were grown in European gardens, and we're looking at it before the spread of roses across the world in the 18th century. Now, these are some people refer to these as the original cultivated roses, the original cultivars, and some people believe that since they are such an old group of roses that they're going to be very, very resistant to diseases. Folks, just because a cultivar has existed since the time of Rome does not mean that it's resistant to disease. That just means it's very old and very lucky. So keep that in mind. So our old European garden roses are split into these 5 different groups, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of them before. I was even talking to my wife and partner about it, and she even recognized some of the names too of these. So Gallica and Damask, these are our ancient roses, is what I would refer to them as. They date back to the Roman Empire. Damask actually nearly became extinct, except it was cultivated by a group of monks in Europe and saved. And so that kind of gives you an idea of how long these roses have been with us. Centifolia and moss roses, these are actually famous because if you look at a still life painting dating way back a couple hundred years in Europe, these are the roses that were featured in those paintings, made famous by different Dutch artists. So if you just see that kind of quintessential still life painting of a rose, this is the rose that we're talking about here. And the Alba rose, of course, was made famous by the bard himself, William Shakespeare, because he often detailed it in some of his works as a delicate, I believe, white flower that he would refer to. So these are our most old roses that we would probably see in the modern world. You're not going to find too many others. Most of them have probably been hybridized since. Now, speaking of hybridization, oh, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit. So a little bit more about our old European roses here. These are roses that are capable of flourishing in our hardiness zone and north of us. So they are 5 and 6. A lot of them are primarily 5. If you go further south, is zone 7 arguably. I would even say a little bit further south than zone 6. You're going to start running into serious trouble trying to maintain some of these older rose species, because these are roses that were cultivated at the tail end of a mini ice age, just post the medieval era. So they are going to have been cultivated in an era where there's a lot cooler temperatures than what we have now. And unfortunately, our temperatures seem to be rising even more. So most likely in a lot of our hemisphere, we're going to lose the ability to cultivate these. There are a lot of myths surrounding these species, and I kind of talked about this a second ago. I want you to keep in mind that even though some people believe that these cultivars are disease resistant, that is not necessarily true. Do not go and buy a centifolia because you will believe that it resists fungal disease. You need to talk to a rose specialist to find out if the one you have or the one you want to grow needs special attention and if it's resistant or not. And please, if you have a question, just go ahead and type it into the chat or hold on to it until we get done. All right, so I was just speaking about our hybridization, our modern roses. This is a general classification given to our varieties that were created after a specific date in 1867. This was due to the creation of the original hybrid tea rose by Jean-Baptiste Guyot. And what he did is he created the first hybrid tea that is known as La France or La France, depending on how you want to pronounce that. Every rose created after that point is considered a modern rose. And I guarantee you that virtually every rose that you have seen probably has been a modern rose. There are a few people who have probably seen things like the Gallica or the Centifolia. These roses, they do exist in our country and they have been grown quite a bit, but most roses that you're going to be working with are probably a modern rose. A lot of us love our hybrid teas, for example. Now, modern roses are going to contain several different classes of rose, including shrub roses. Now, one thing I want to make sure is clear is that the classification of shrub rose is kind of a catch-all. It is intended to catch roses that don't really fit into any one category or another. Honestly, it's not the best category that should exist because a lot of things that we would call a shrub rose are actually floribunda. And then there are just a few funny outliers in there. But our modern roses do include our hybrid teas, as evidenced by the original hybrid tea being created. Floribunda roses, which are roses that tend to be bushy. This is what I would think of as a shrub rose, so not necessarily. Floribunda were created when someone hybridized a polyantho rose with a hybrid variety that they were working with. Grandiflora are our roses that have the big, gigantic blooms on them. And what happened there is that someone hybridized a Floribunda and they created the Grandiflora rose. And then of course, our miniature roses that we see. These are some of our climbers and other smaller rose species. Again, some of our more funny things that are typically very, very delicate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just a few modern classifications of roses. Our hybrid teas first, of course. This is perhaps the most popular rose variety grown today. Everybody and their uncle has a hybrid that they themselves have either gotten from someone or they've developed their own family. I think I saw someone in the chat earlier saying that they have a rose that was cultivated by one of their grandparents. The American Rose Society maintains a very extensive list of different cultivars. And in a future program this year, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit some of those most popular cultivars because I think it's going to be really fascinating to kind of dig in deep there. Hybrid tea roses often feature long canes with large blooms that can be very, very fragrant. Unfortunately, hybrid teas are kind of a little bit of the Wild West when it comes to roses, because depending on how they were hybridized, they can have some really great features, like they're a gorgeous rose that's very fragrant, but they may not be very, very durable. Whereas if you were hearing my when I was talking about earlier about the hybrid tea that I have in my yard, it's a nice little rose bush. The blooms aren't very big, they never get large. It's got a good fragrance to it. And I swear it's survived like 3 ice storms without being covered. So there you go. Hybrid teas can kind of span the whole gamut of what they can survive and what they can't. Now, our knockout roses, this is a very popular variety, and this is one that is often planted as a garden ornamental. You can kind of put them anywhere. Knockout roses are supposed to be disease resistant, and oftentimes they're very environmentally resistant too. They can tend to survive just some really unpleasant areas for roses, so they make a great thing to plant as an ornament, like along a driveway or something. These are very resistant to fungal disease. The knockout that I have that I was complaining doesn't do very well. It has not yet gotten any kind of fungal illness. It just has a growth problem where I think it was improperly pruned years ago and it's never gotten over it. Knockout roses are able to constantly produce clusters of flowers in large numbers. So for those of you who are familiar with the varieties that I was mentioning earlier, you'll recognize that knockout roses actually belong to the group Floribunda, according to the research I was doing earlier. So that's where that belongs. So some people refer to knockout roses as a shrub rose, which I'm not entirely sure that's accurate. With a knockout rose too, pruning is relatively easy. All you're doing is you're going to keep that center relatively clear. You're going to you don't really need to shape them too much, and you're just managing the canes at that point. You want to make sure that they don't get too tangled in the interior of the bush. Climbing roses. This is the one that I'm looking forward to experimenting with, because we planted a climbing rose and it's right next to this little metal wire gazebo that we have on my property, and I want to see if we can get it to climb onto the gazebo. However, this will be a challenge. Climbing roses are not your beginner rose. These are great though, because they have a lot of different uses. They can be gorgeous, have these really delicate, beautiful blossoms, and they can be very fragrant. And there are different cultivars that are actually disease resistant. They will bloom very heavily in the spring, and then they'll do little scatterings of blooms throughout the summer. So they make for a great start to the spring, and they'll keep providing blooms throughout the season, though not as many as to start. However, this one has a high maintenance requirement. It will need help training onto whatever it's going to be growing onto. It may be more delicate because rose plants that climb tend to be more brittle depending on how they were hybridized. So you're going to want to care for them and baby them as much as you can until they get really well established. And even then, you're still looking at a lot of pruning work afterwards. Okay, so we are out of talking about some of our varieties of roses. Let's talk about working with some of our different methods of planting and caring for roses. Now, one of the ones that people often go with is what is referred to as a bare root rose. And I'm sure a lot of you have probably planted or gotten a bare root rose where you've ordered them, got it mailed to you, and it's a few of the canes that and the bud union with the roots poking down into a bag. Bare root roses are a great way to plant roses, but the trouble is that they come with a few problems themselves. So if you're working with a bare root rose, you're going to want to get the rose in your hands as close to the planting time as possible. Unfortunately, the bag that's maintaining the rose can actually encourage a fungal disease to develop in it, I think botrytis. And so you're going to want to make sure you care for that as carefully as you can. You're going to want to get it in the ground just as soon as the soil can be worked. And before that, if you're forced to hang on to the rose and not yet plant it, you want to make sure you maintain good moisture in the package, but not too much. And you want to make sure you keep it in a dark place, because the minute those canes get exposed to sunlight, they're going to treat themselves as though, oh, hey, the sun is out, I'm going to start growing now. And you're possibly going to have the plant suffer a little bit as its energy now goes towards that. Now, before you plant your bare root roses, you're going to want to soak the rose roots for about 8 to 12 hours to get them properly rehydrated in the conditions that it's going to grow in. Basically, you're giving them a jump start to get those roots fully reactivated. Go through the roots. Make sure that the roots are in good condition. If you find damaged roots or roots that are infected, you're going to want to remove those before you put it in the ground. Because if you put an infected root into the ground, that means that the soil is now contaminated with it, and you're going to struggle with planting things in that spot for some time until it works itself out. You may want to consider using a fungicide to treat the roots or the rose, depending on what it looks like when you obtain it. All right, this is just an example of what a bare root rose planting can look like. Here, she's actually doing a little bit of pruning on it too after a cold snap, as you can see. So once you've got it in the ground, you're going to maintain about 3 to 5 canes per plant, and you're going to prune it back to that same 3 to 5 buds per cane. This is so that way the rose isn't spreading all of its energy across canes that may not be able to survive. Anything that is thinner than a pencil, any canes that are thinner than a pencil, you should just go ahead and remove those. It's not going to be worth the energy to try to keep those alive. Any soft shoots that are coming up should be removed. They aren't going to survive. If you're putting this in the ground, as soon as the soil can be worked, it's still going to be way too cold for a soft shoot. However, the existing canes should be able to survive just fine so long as they weren't previously damaged. Now, this image right here is giving you an idea of how you should plant the bare root rose once you do so. And there are some things on here that I want you to note. So you're seeing here that the canes themselves are poking upwards through the soil, but the bud union is 2 to 4 inches below the soil. You want that bud union to stay nice and warm underneath the soil so that way it's not exposed to cold temperatures. That is going to be your growing point. That is where all your canes are going to come from. And if that gets damaged by cold or something else, you're going to lose a whole rose bush. You'll also notice that they planted the roots in that soil cone at the bottom beforehand. So what they've done is they've dug a hole in the ground that's about 20 inches down or so, according to this diagram. They went ahead and covered the rose roots at about 14 to 18 inches. And then they covered the bud union after that. So that way the only thing coming up out of the soil are going to be those canes. I'm going to go back a couple images here, and you can actually see this in this image. You can't see the bud union or anything else at all. The only thing you can see are those canes just coming right up out of the soil. Another tactic to help develop your roses a little further is this concept of sweating roses. This is when you're going to cover younger canes with a paper bag to try to conserve moisture and protect canes from the wind. So I don't know about you guys. I grew up here in Indiana, and spring in Indiana normally stays a little bit cold and a little bit windy for quite a while. And we want to make sure that we protect those roses as they grow up their young. Excuse me. And what this will do is the bag will allow that growth to begin. It'll allow the roses to really start developing. And then once they do so, you can slowly begin to remove the bag and let that sunlight in there so that the rose can really begin to leaf out as the season gets rolling. Okay, so a little bit on potted roses now. So the great thing about potted roses, we're going to treat this a little bit like our bare root planting, except someone has already done a little bit of your work for you. You're going to want to loosen the roots from whatever potted soil they're in. And I'm going to quietly pray that whenever you guys get a potted rose, it is not just completely bound up in itself, because that can sometimes be a struggle too, if you get it from someone who didn't take proper care of it. Loosen the roots up. Make sure you're following the same rules as before. Make sure the bud union is under the surface of the soil. Make sure the roots are very deep in that soil there. And this image here gives you a great idea of what it should look like once you go ahead and plant the rose. All right, so let's talk a little bit about fertilizer application. Roses, like I said, they are a little bit delicate and they definitely need some babying. So that means you are going to need to fertilize them. They will need food. They have rather high nutrition requirements. So the thing that I'm going to tell all of you first to do is to get a soil test. Let me repeat that, get a soil test. And if I'm going to recommend it one more time, I'm going to recommend getting a soil test done. Hopefully you guys are catching my drift. If you do so, that means you will know what is going on in your soil. That way you know what you're working with. Don't walk into this blind. Most soil tests only cost about $10 to $20, and it'll be very easy to do. That way you can see what organic compounds are there, what food is there in measures of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. Now, the good thing about roses is that they can use organic or inorganic or a combination of both when it comes to fertilizer. So that means that you can use things like manure, etc. You're going to be looking for higher phosphorus values, and you can often buy in the store fertilizer that is specific for roses. I actually have one in my house that I've been using on my roses for the last year. So oftentimes you'll find them and it'll say right on the label, this is for roses. And all you have to do is you look for the little K symbol, little P symbol, to see if it has a higher rating compared to the nitrogen and potassium. That'll be the second number on the bag that you're looking for, in case you're wondering. You're going to want to use about 3 pounds per 100 square feet, or 1 heaping tablespoon per plant. I would arguably say be a little judicious when you do this. This is why your soil test is going to be important. You don't want to overdo it on any fertilizer. Now, high phosphorus fertilizer probably has lower nitrogen, so less risk of burning the plant. But at the same time, once the plant's burned, it's burned. So you want to be a little bit careful as you apply this stuff. The first application should happen in the spring after the last frost. If you put it on there before the last frost, that means some of it's going to get wasted. Don't fertilize after July. If you do so, you're wasting your money. The plant needs to harden, and that means we need to lower its food requirements or its food allotment. And that way it'll begin to harden up as we get closer to the cold season. So roses prefer slightly acidic soil, and that's a good thing because throughout a lot of Indiana, we sit right at slightly acidic. Roses will prefer 5.5 to 6.5 pH, which means a lot of our yards will, or the locations where we put our roses, are actually going to need only a very slight change in pH, if any at all. Ground limestone will work to raise pH if it's needed. It will help supply calcium. I will also encourage you guys to manage your watering here, because as we apply our fertilizers, we typically see that plants may go through something called blossom end rot when they're not able to get enough calcium, and that is due to a lack of watering. So make sure you're taking into account how much you want to water these plants. If the pH needs to be lowered, you can use ground sulfur at a rate of about 8 ounces per 100 square feet, though honestly, I doubt that you'll run into that very often. And when it comes to roses, what I would say is that if your soil test is telling you that the pH is all wrong, like it's rather high or very low, then I would simply plant in a different location and save yourself the time. All right, a little bit more on pH management and fertilizer here. So I talked a bit about manure. Aged manure is going to be a really, really good fertilizer, but you want to make sure it is aged. If you use fresh manure, you can cause a burn. So that's that nitrogen issue again. Too much nitrogen and you scorch the leaves. I'm sorry, I got a couple questions here that I'm looking, and I know I missed a few earlier. As for where you can get your soil tested in Marion County, what I would do is I would call your extension office or contact them in Marion County. I'm afraid I am not aware of where you can get that done in that particular county. Gwen, you were asking, can roses be ground well in a pot? I am not sure what you mean there, Gwen. Can you expand on that one a little bit? Because it could be you're talking about something that I just know a little bit more of in a different set of terms. All right, so we were talking about manure a little bit there. And I was saying that aged manure is going to work best there. It does make a good fertilizer. You're going to want to avoid using fresh manure because you want to avoid that burn. You're also going to spread it to a depth of 2 to 3 inches to get it really good and down in the soil. That's going to promote your organic material there. Liquid fish, bone meal, blood meal, those are great things that are going to work well as well. So they're going to offer good protein organic content there for the soil. All right, so sometimes what I consider the most dreaded commenting here when it comes to roses is commenting on pruning. Pruning is definitely one of those things that is very up in the air, that is debated by many, but I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about what I consider the best practices with trying to make sure your roses stay pruned. Let's see, I got another question here. If a rose has been planted for many years, do you recommend covering the bud union with additional soil? I would just make sure that the bud union is underground at least 2 to 4 inches. If the rose has been going for years and the bud union has been exposed for years, then I mean, the rose has been able to survive. It's probably gotten used to its environment and hardened up itself. But I would definitely consider trying to get it underground because you just don't want to lose that bud union, because that means you could lose the whole rose. All right, so a little on pruning here. Don't prune if the plant is weak or small. If you have a plant that is already at risk, pruning puts it more at risk. Remember, when we prune, we damage the plant intentionally and with care, but we're still damaging the plant. So if the plant's already weak, don't do it. Deadheading is a process that's often used with roses. That's where you prune back to an outward facing bud above a 5 or 7 leaflet leaf. So you're going back down to a certain point. However, you may want to avoid any hips if those are a part of your display. Don't do any pruning after October 1st. That way the plant can harden and you haven't wounded it to create an opening where it could be damaged by cooler temperatures more easily. As you come out of your winter nap, you're going to be doing a little more pruning depending on what's going on. And this image here that Rosie has, it makes a great example of it. So what you see here is that Rosie is actually doing pruning of canes that were damaged by the cold. Now you see here, she's doing this before any new foliage emerges, because that way the plant's energy is not going towards growing leaves. And you can assess the plant for any kind of dieback damage. Now, what we're looking for here are canes that have been blackened or damaged by the cold. In this image, I love it because it perfectly shows you what I'm talking about. You can see she's got the shears and she's going to take that cane off because as we look at it, it's clearly damaged. You can see that she's already done this for a few other canes already too. Here's kind of a close-up image. I apologize for the image quality of what it's going to look like when you need to consider pruning. You can see that there are green canes on here, but the ones that we're focused on right now are just brown and dead. These bits need to go, but we're only going to prune it back to the nearest growing point, to the nearest bud. So go ahead and remove the brown and damaged stuff, but you're not just chopping off the entire cane. You can see here's another example of some canes that have been damaged by the cold. You can also see where they were pruned back to. As you can see, the canes, some of these canes were really badly damaged by some of the cold, so they're going to have to take a heavy pruning. So we're cutting it back down to an outward facing bud. The reason for this is we don't want the roses to grow inwards on themselves. We don't want the bush to get congested in the middle or to get tangled with itself. We want it outward facing, so that way it's going to continue to grow outwards. Any more specific pruning, that's going to depend on the kind of rose that we're working with. So the advice that you would get for pruning a knockout is definitely going to be different than the advice for pruning something that is a climber. And so keep that in mind if you have questions on that. When it comes to our bush type grafted rose, when it comes to pruning, cut 4 to 8 canes to uniform height, spreading away from the center. Again, we want to avoid that congestion. And remove canes that arise from below the graft union, because then you're not getting the kind of rose you want. You want to make sure everything that's coming out is coming up above that graft union, so you're getting the stuff that you intend on growing there. Climbing roses, usually these require only a little bit of pruning. Remember, these are delicate and sometimes it's best to just leave them be. So if they're ever bloomer climbers, then you're just going that consistently flower. You don't need to prune a whole lot. They're just going to do their own thing and keep going. But you do want to remove any dead or weak wood and then remove any older canes that have quit producing. Don't leave the canes on there if they quit blooming, because at that point they're just an energy sink and you're not getting that energy going towards producing new buds and new blooms. Our ramblers and large flowered climbers, these typically bloom only once a year, so we're looking at some of our grandiflora possibly here. Pruning should happen right after the blooms fade, because if they only bloom once a year and they're done, then go ahead and do your pruning after that point. The buds will form on the previous year's growth. Remove this year's canes to make room for next year, because once it's done, and you want to move on. Now our shrub roses, and I feel like I need to retitle this slide again. Our shrub roses rarely need shaped. Usually their shape will take care of itself, and if you prune them too much, it can cause damage. So for example, the knockout rose on my property probably got over pruned and pruned incorrectly. Limit it to remove any dead or damaged wood. That's all you want to do. You just want to get rid of any dead or damaged wood. You're going to want to thin that excessive growth, especially towards the center of the plant, because then it's going to get congested and it's going to start choking itself out. All right, that's what I've got to say on pruning and roses in general. Again, I'm going to be doing more programs on this, so guys, please keep paying attention and we will bring you more stuff as the year goes on. And now I am going to go ahead